game developers, what is something gamers on the internet always claim to be easy to do or fix, when in reality it's a real pain in the ass. I remember playing Don't Starve when it first came out and thinking I wish this was multiplayer, but I know it's a ton of work, they'll never do it. Then a few months later they announced that due to popular demand, they had rewritten the entire game in a different programming language that was better suited to multiplayer, and then released it as Don't Starve together. The devs had just decided that it was easier to redo the entire thing from the ground up than it was to try to add on multiplayer functionality to a game original intended to be single player. Exactly. So many scripts needs to be adjusted and rewritten, and a lot of the times you need to change the whole mechanism and rewrite the whole script simply because it doesn't work on multiplayer. I got paid $200 from an indie game studio, just to give them a theoretical solution to make a hockey stick movement not look weird. Even a tiny thing like stick movement is affected by making a game multiplayer. And it's not an overpay, since even this thing that looks so small and easy involves a fuck ton of math and physics. Good lord, I cut my teeth on simple Minecraft mods, but even then you had to wrap your head around server-client communication. Writing a single-player game is like making a rubber band-powered model plane. Very few parts. Easy to see how they all interact. Pretty easy to see what breaks. Writing a multiplayer game is like designing fighter jet. There are so many moving parts, and if one breaks, it cascades into a giant mess. Was it the server-client handshake? Did I spawn that entity on the server or the client? Why can these clients see that but this one can't? Why the hell are you over there all of a sudden? You have the same stats. Why are you different? How in the hell are you moving on the Z-axis? Local or online multiplayer. I've been playing a game that I really wish had local multiplayer, and my sister said I wouldn't make sense since there is only one feasible playable character. So I said, couldn't they just add a copy of the main character for another person to control? So both could be the main character and it wouldn't ruin the plot. So I've been wondering if it really would be just add a copy of the main character, or if there are some other technical difficulty that I don't know about. It's kind of like the experiment with kids, where you tell them to write down the precise instructions for making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Then the kids look on with a mix of shame, horror, and humor as you proceed to smear peanut butter with your hands because they didn't specify using a knife. I doesn't inherently know anything, which means the programmer suddenly has to consciously consider a lot of things that are not thought about at all. When you consider that not even physics exist in a game until you program them to exist, the complications of coding NPC responses to PC actions make a lot more sense. Player is in sneak mode. Why? Player is in NPC field of view. Why? Player is below sneak skill level X. Why? Random probability of failure between % and %. Player is detected. Player takes object with ownership tag. NPC sees the crime and reports it. Gosh, it seems so simple. Too bad NPC is a chicken, and now your game crime watch chickens. It doesn't work. God damn. There is a reason me writing bug reports has picked up since I did support. I realized people are plain unable to write bug reports. Edit, after having it written out like a dozen times. Sometimes a feature does not work. However, things only have one way to work right, but dozens to thousands of ways to not work, so stating in which way it did not work is important. Key elements of a helpful bug report are: what were you doing? Be precise. How did you get there? What exactly did you click? Interact with. What did you expect to happen? What did happen? Once more, try to use precise words. Avoid general words like work. Ideally include environment information, system information, information about your progress, character, logs, internet information. I had the opportunity to sit with a developer, not game, and test out an app for bugs. Found 3 sitting there and was able to show them how to recreate it. They were able to use that info and fix it after 3 weeks. Only recently did I get a chance to do it again. Something broke horribly and I got in contact with a lead developer. I did my best to describe, because he let me know that someone had previously said this was a problem but they didn't know how to recreate it. So I replicated it twice on my phone and on my laptop. I gave them the make, model, year of the device as well as the numbers for the version of OS they're running for, not just the laptop and phone but the browser I was using. I then included how I got to the website from and what buttons I clicked to get to the part where it broke. I even mentioned if I scrolled before I clicked. The developer told me they almost cried because I gave them so much detail they were able to get a third party to recreate the problem and were able to fix it that day. If you ever have a problem with the software, you can never give too much detail to a developer. They crave details. Since that dev told me they nearly cried, they've had me attempt to recreate 2 other bugs and have told me I should become a UI UX tester. While flattered, I'm wary to get into it because I don't know coding. I had a bipolar boss once ask how long it would take to fix a newly discovered bug. I told him I had no idea as we just learned about it. Once we can track it down and figure out what's causing a bug, then I can give you an estimate on how long to fix. He wasn't happy. He said other developers always told him how long to fix it. I told him they were lying because immediately after a typical bug is found, it's an unknown on what's causing it, and until that can be tracked down, it's basically impossible to know how long to fix when you don't know what's causing it. Fuck you, Peter. Even when the physics are handled by your underlying game engine for the most part, nailing down the details of how your engine does things can become critically important. I once worked on a driving simulator and we had this recurring issue pop up every few weeks. Someone would report that the steering wheel would just start wobbling after a period of time and the car would gradually become more and more uncontrollable. The problem was, it only happened to some people. Sometimes, the only constant was that it was usually during longer playthroughs. I tried to debug this issue for weeks before finally realizing what was happening. Turns out, Unity's physics engine does some of its floating point calculations based on your X, Y, Z position in the game world. The farther you are from the world origin, the larger these values get, meaning the equations started introducing more and more floating point rounding errors as you got further and further from where you started. So anyone in our simulator who drove down the highway for a long stretch, then got off, could be 5,000 meters from origin and suddenly they start losing control because the vehicle controller's steering math was all out of whack. Rather than rewriting the vehicle controller, we opted for a super janky hack in which whenever we detect the user has moved too far from origin, we pause the physics engine for 1 frame, lifter and shift every single asset in the world back towards the origin. Thank God for procedurally generated worlds that can be moved like this, then unpause the physics engine. The impact was mostly unnoticeable to the driver, and it fixed the bug. Can confirm from personal experience, pretty much handled physics single-handedly for the previous studio I was at. Cloth simulations in particular were a nightmare. They were calculated on the CPU and the results varied greatly depending on the hardware being played on. For majority of the player base it was fine, but every once in a while you'd get the report with screenshots or videos of things going horribly wrong. Then you'd see they were playing on a 2 GHz long from 2005 and there's really nothing you can do. I think the gold standard is Woob, the devs behind Factorio. Small team, slow update development, because they absolutely hammer out bug fixes and rewriting code just to make it work slightly better before worrying about adding new content. New content is exciting, gets new players, while increasing average FPS by 5 for low-end players might take 3 times as long to achieve and gets a fraction of the engagement. But from a pure capitalist standpoint, people will clearly buy unoptimized garbage, so why waste money spending dev time making it run better? Former AAA game developer. The hardest thing the internet asks for and thinks is easy is just add multiplayer. I worked at a primarily single-player studio, and our current project was going to be the first multiplayer game we launched. It was a custom engine, so it had to be rewritten around the new network stack, and that was written by a single rockstar programmer, which means he owned it aggressively and got angry at you when it didn't work, which was frequently. So, integrating basic gameplay things like object moved to new position on client, have the other client's update basically had to flow through him, and he was a major bottleneck but also invaluable to the company. So, the lesson here is that to add multiplayer, you need a decent team of knowledgeable network programmers, whose skills don't overlap with normal gameplay programmers that much. Second, once we got the framework running, we were able to start implementing systems and handing the hooks for those off to designers to start scripting on top of. They do things like if damage changed, flash character red and play sound, that sort of stuff. Educating non-technical designers on how to write good multiplayer scripts was a non-trivial task, and that took a lot of development time fixing their bugs. Simple things where it would work on the client machine, but not the remote machine. Finally, the largest issue was deployment at scale. Several shitty things happening, like our publisher accidentally giving away a few thousand copies, but that's another story. Like I said, our tech stack was fairly rickety and new, so we had regular logon and profile issues, matchmaking problems where the matchmaker gave up too early, and game desync issues. All of these led directly to a low player population, and guess what makes matchmaking and bug finding even harder? Low player population. In the end, the plug was pulled shortly after launch, and the tech was recycled into another multiplayer game after we hired several more programmers and designers who had experience with these sorts of things. The project that launched after it was more successful. All in all, this process took about 6 years. Every single-player game where the developer hasn't done a multiplayer game before would probably have to go through this, or similar, to make that game multiplayer. So when you say, just add multiplayer, that's around a $1 million ask, as an underestimate. See, the current state of Elite Dangerous. The actual coders are brilliant. Even in alpha, the Odyssey expansion itself was rock solid, if a little choppy. It's the gameplay decisions on top of the code over the last 6 years that seem like they were consistently made by people who have never played video games in their lives. If you make gameplay decisions, in any long-term game really, it should be mandatory to have a minimum number of logged hours playing the game every week. It should be just as important as showing up, with serious consequences for not meeting the quota. You should be so sick of playing the game that your eyes bleed. That's how you find out what parts of your game are boring or nonsensical, and need to be changed. Too many companies think it's appropriate to appoint someone as manager that went to school for business as an MBA or some shit and have no actual knowledge of the jobs they are overseeing. Those people are only thinking about money, protecting the company, and nothing else. Don't hire these people to manage creative departments. It doesn't make sense. It should work the other way around for most roles. You should be able to do the jobs that you are overseeing first before getting into a position of manager. Then you can learn how to be an effective manager. How else are you going to understand what the effort actually is to complete a project, or manage stress, or know what fucking resources you need to complete something, if you have no understanding of the actual jobs involved in completing a project? It's so bizarre the way some companies are ran. I'm a higher-level architect in my org. My days of dealing with ops is way behind me, but I got those guys back. About 6 months ago I got in a big fight with one of our directors that we need to do something because we're forcing the ops guys to do manual work. It's not often, but lord is it tedious, and the fix is maybe a sprint or two. The director just kept calling it a waste of time. And finally I said, I understand you don't think it's worth it because you don't actually have to do the work, but you need to trust me here. The glare I got back could have burned a hole through me. We got it prioritized. Anything client-side is vulnerable to hackers. Anything server-side eats server processing, memory, and bandwidth. So we believe the clinic where it isn't hackers get no clip, or we don't and everyone else gets rubber banding, or we believe but keep track of where they are, and kick if they move to impassable places, then everyone gets random kicked sometimes. I wonder if that's less hard now with the consoles getting closer architecturally. Back in say the MD era, you had different resolutions, pixel aspects, CPU architectures, background restrictions, color depths, so a game would usually look better on one platform as that was made first. On the other hand, I can totally see there being a devil in the details between two, in theory, x64 boxes. As a porting engineer for a pretty large games company, I hate seeing why isn't this on Switch and can you release it on PS5. It's so much more difficult to port a game than it seems because every console has its own specs and its own API that you have to integrate, and then you get console-specific crashes and bugs like I get his error on Switch, but not on PC or Xbox. And then on top of that, asking a studio to port a massive game to Nintendo Switch and then complaining that the textures don't look great or that the graphics are crap. From a game dev's perspective, the Switch is a glorified smartphone, so it's not going to have the specs to run a graphically intense game at ultra settings. Sorry about the rant, seeing porting triggered me. Pretty much everything you can imagine, as even if the change itself is simple, it's constrained by dependent systems and content. If I change jump height, any levels that have already been made with the old height in mind may have to be remade. If I change how crafting works, the inventory system may need a revision. If I add a cover mechanic, all levels must now be updated with cover objects, and I needs to be updated to know what cover and cover objects means. If I add a third-person camera perspective to an FPS, each action that is animated in first person has to be reviewed for how it works in third person. Also, the levels have to be updated because the camera can now exist outside of the player character. If I change the speed at which the player character moves, level streaming may need an adjustment. And if the bottleneck is hardware speed, I may need to compromise on audio-visual fidelity instead. If my game uses FMV cutscenes, content design might be forced by what happens in those cutscenes. If it's not in the budget to render them again as the design changes, games are houses of cards more often than not. If I change the speed at which the player character moves, level streaming may need an adjustment. And if the bottleneck is hardware speed, I may need to compromise on audio-visual fidelity instead. One of my favorite stories regarding this is during play testing on the original Borderlands, and players requested the character ran quicker. What they ended up doing was adding more detail to the ground like rocks and scrubs of grass. These things whizzing past while running gave the illusion of higher speed, and when given back to the play testers they said it was a lot better. Edit, chill with the awards guys. I'm just repeating something I read in an article. Many thanks. House of Cards built on top of a House of Cards if developer is using a proprietary engine. Hawk built on top of a Hawk bullet on top of a Hawk if that same game has any kind critical online feature including but not limited to online multiplayer. This is all not including the business aspect of making games, aka keeping the dev company from going under. BRB, I need to go to Costco to buy some more cards. I love how I'm scrolling through the comments and see pretty much every aspect of a game being listed, game designer and game developer cutting and just agreeing XD. For me personally, I work in research and QA right now. And let me tell you, QA is not just sitting around and playing the game. I'm sorry, but the game isn't even remotely finished and it's not balanced or fun at all just yet. So no, I'm bored of going through the same motion, seeing every bit of the map for the 10th time, trying to find some bugs the programmers have to fix. It's just annoying. QA is hard and important work that's also super unappreciated and misunderstood. We once had a bug in our PvP mode that happened frequently, was game breaking, but no one could figure out how to repro it. We put in breakpoints. We tested internally. We made desperate cries to our players to send us info. Nada. This went on for months. One of our hero QA guys made it his mission to figure it out and eventually he did. It had a 24-step STR. 100% repro. We fixed it that evening. Moral of the story, be good to QA. I've made precisely one game in my life. Balancing was a fun problem to solve, but also an incredibly difficult one. I didn't get it exactly right, so I wound up with a game that was, nearly, impossibly hard at later levels if you didn't grind for a bit at much easier, lower levels. The thing that surprised me the most was how sensitive everything was. Even small changes to things like damage output of a weapon or strength/defense/HP of an enemy could throw the whole system out of sync. And balancing everything while also providing variety to enemies, that is, differences in difficulty or style as opposed to just similar enemies with different names, was ridiculously hard to achieve.